Hello and welcome to Fintech Chatter, brought to you by Tier 1 People, leaders in Fintech executive search. I'm your host, Dexter Cousins. Today's guest is Niki Ariyasinghe, Head of Business Development, Asia Pacific at Chainlink Labs. Chainlink is the industry standard Oracle network for powering hybrid smart contracts. Managed by a global decentralized community, Chainlink currently secures billions of dollars in value for smart contracts across DeFi, insurance, gaming, and other major sectors. Niki shares his thoughts on DeFi and how the technology is poised to bring a revolutionary change to banking. But before we chat to Niki, I've got a special opportunity to share with our tech community. This one's for all you engineers out there who've been engaged by a leader in the digital banking space to find an engineering lead. It's a newly created role reporting to the CTO. You'll be the person who gets to build one of the best banking apps on the planet. For more info, check out the show notes or head over to the Tier 1 People LinkedIn page. Niki, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dexter. Great to be here.
It's been 12 months since we last had you on the show for the blockchain special. Mate, well, a lot has happened in this last 12 months.
Indeed.
Could you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and Chainlink Labs?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dexter. And hi, everybody. I think for us, if you think about blockchain, you would have heard the terminology and so on. And blockchains can do many, many amazing things. But if you zoom out just a little bit, blockchains have a particular security model and have a particular way to get data that's not on the chain onto the chain. And so I'll give a couple of examples, but that area of getting off-chain data onto a blockchain is really what Chainlink specializes in. And it does that by this method called the decentralized oracles. So if you can imagine a blockchain sitting out there, it could be the Ethereum network, which many of you would have heard about. It might be Hyperledger Fabric, might be a private chain, whatever it may be. As smart contracts execute on those particular chains, at a certain point, they will typically need some form of input data. And I think we'll get into this discussion later on. But if you think about the concept of decentralized finance, smart contracts executing in that sector, they want to know, as an example, what is the price of Bitcoin? And that's a very simple question, but it's actually a tough one to answer. And so via this method of decentralized oracles, and I can go through some of the details, we're able to provide a highly secure, unadulterated perspective or number on what is the actual price of Bitcoin that hasn't been manipulated, that could input into those particular smart contracts. So that's one simple example, but fundamentally it goes back to getting off-chain data securely onto a blockchain.
So you joined Chainlink Labs recently, Niki. What was your reason for joining them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a few. I mean, and bearing in mind, my passion for blockchain overall started back in 2014 and very much came out of Bitcoin and all things public blockchain. And so I worked at a company called Abra in Silicon Valley, and then obviously moved back to Sydney to help set up at R3 in APAC. And I think R3 and private blockchains, permission blockchains, have a very interesting role to play as the enterprise sector evolves, for example. But my passion had always been about getting back to driving growth on the public blockchain side, creating these very interesting and new value propositions. So that was one, just really wanted to get back to my crypto roots, as I like to say. And the second part was this opportunity with Chainlink. So Sergey Nazarov, CEO, and I had been speaking for 6 to 9 months on and off. And we're really looking at the right point in their growth trajectory to join and to kind of create a kind of new part of their ecosystem. And it's just for me, it's just a very, very, very exciting ecosystem and a very exciting company that I think has, I like to say actually to people that I'm interviewing, for example, I think Chainlink Labs and Chainlink as an ecosystem has the potential to be one of those truly transformative ecosystems in the next decade. So really a lot of excitement and passion for me.
Now, I often think of DeFi as the disruptor of the disruptors. And what I mean by that is the potential of the technology to not only disrupt the banking industry, but also disrupt the fintech industry and what we've seen so far. What are you seeing through DeFi, and what do you think are some of the warning signals that the banking sector needs to look out for?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fantastic question, and I think it's amazing to see this tremendous amount of change play out. You were mentioning earlier that it's been a year since you and I caught up, and that's basically been just over a year is the life cycle of DeFi thus far. DeFi really boomed in the North American summer last year, and now it's where it's at. So crazy to think that DeFi as a category was just over $1 billion of total value locked roughly around this time last year. And now we're back up to 70 billion, I think, roughly speaking. So the pace of change is tremendous. But I think there's two key aspects here. One is, what is DeFi? And at the highest possible level, it's this, bearing in mind DeFi stands for decentralized finance. It's essentially the use of smart contracts being executed on a blockchain, typically a public blockchain, to create some form of financial instrument or financial product or financial outcome. So at a slightly again a high level esoteric view, it's those three concepts: smart contract plus a blockchain leading to some form of financial instrument or outcome. And then and we can go into some of the details, but I think taking a slightly historical view, and for those that are obviously listening on this podcast that are deep in financial services or fintech, whatever it may be, I think it's amazing to see the evolution or the point we're at now in the evolution of financial services. So I think back to, say, for example, 2010 or 2011 when I was working at ING in Australia, and we were pitching really innovative.
Do you know that's when you and I first connected?
Right. There you go.
Me trying to headhunt you from ING.
There you go. So that's blast from the past. I love it, Dexter. So it's interesting, right? Like how much it's evolved. Yes, that's 11 years. But, I remember back then we were pitching ideas like, a mobile-based banking sub-brand focused on millennials, so 2010, 2011, which wasn't, approved back then because we were obviously dealing with the fallout from the financial crisis. And by that stage, compliance was eating up most of the change budget.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is, obviously then, and I like to say I was into fintech before it became cool, which is back then. And then obviously, it's picked up momentum, and you have these amazing companies that have been built like Revolut and Monzo and Starling and a whole host of others locally and internationally. I think a lot of those offerings are really exciting. They play with the UXs. They find interesting ways to engage customers. They even build interesting products based on kind of new offerings and new target segments. But they don't fundamentally change what banking is at its core, at its back end, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And I think as we've seen play out over the last year, core back end banking is very, very hard. Balance sheet management is very, very hard. And obviously the local banks, like the official regulated banks, do it well. And neobanks have had a lot of challenges with that. But what's interesting is, I, even before this kind of DeFi wave, wouldn't have necessarily thought that there was an emerging opportunity to change that back end. But that's fundamentally what DeFi is doing. It's really asking the question, some fundamental questions. Firstly, and this is a very esoteric question, very Bitcoin related, but what is money, right? So whether it's Bitcoin, Ethereum, whether it's a stable coin, whatever it may be, what is money? Secondly, how do you invest that money? And so there are some very interesting ideas being deployed where you have whole new financial products being built right from their core concept, like from the very basic building blocks. And new products are being deployed on chain. And importantly, and this is the decentralized aspect of it, it's accessible by anybody. And what's amazing is the life cycle of a product in the DeFi ecosystem can be supremely short. Andre Cronje, who's pretty famous DeFi programmer, in fact, last year actually was launched an experimental product which lived and died within about 24 hours. So we're kind of seeing this experimentation with financial products operating in real time. And so that's, I think, a lot of the value, the power, the excitement around DeFi is it's calling into question those core fundamental building blocks of finance, quote unquote, but it goes to the core of what is money, how do you invest that money, what return do I get for investing that money? And then the mechanics of how that process occurs is fully customizable. It's utilization of various building blocks across the DeFi ecosystem to build completely new offerings and protocols and so on. But I think that's really the exciting part, is it really goes to the core of what is finance.
Feels like I've gone a bit full circle with you, Niki, when you think back to 2011. And as you pointed out, a lot of the innovation that we were seeing back then was really kind of internal innovation around process improvement,
right,
processes, etc. This next wave of innovation, as you mentioned, the Revoluts, the Starlings, the Monzos, front-end CX, better ways of engaging with customers. But as you've pointed out, not really fundamentally changing the products. There's been tweaks. This next wave in DeFi seems to be that what we're now seeing is a completely new evolution of products. And so rather than a slick front end, but getting the same old product I've had for the last 30 years, we're seeing products built specifically for this time that we're in, but also the world that we're going to be living in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's absolutely part of that evolution. And it's amazing to see that convergence, in fact, because a lot of that initial wave, I was mentioning the kind of quote unquote DeFi summer last year, that was very much blockchain natives, like building completely new products from the ground up that are typically going to be deployed and utilized by crypto native customers and users. And now, as people have caught on to the fact that there is tremendous amount of value being created here, there are concepts that can be leveraged both in the centralized finance world and the traditional finance world. We have this convergence now happening where very large banks, global tier one banks, are actively asking that question of us and many of our friends across the ecosystem, how they can leverage those particular concepts. They're exploring what particular products they can build so that they can then start bringing some of that value to their customer base as well. So you've got this really interesting convergence where you started from a crypto native and DeFi native side of the equation, and now it's both, that side of the equation is also coming slightly to the center, and then it's also the concepts are also being leveraged on the traditional finance side as well.
So a huge announcement here in Australia last week, Niki, with Square announcing that they intended to acquire Afterpay. Square last year were one of the reasons that I think that we've seen a huge kind of tear in the Bitcoin price. They've been big supporters of the technology. What do you see as the future for fintechs and those fintechs that have built businesses and models around the kind of old world of money and the old way of exchanging value?
I would tend to lean on the side of the scale that is very much an opportunity right now, both in terms of fintechs as well as banks. I think the key thing to figure out is, if you think about what DeFi is right now, there's tremendous amounts of innovation, volatility, excitement, ups and downs, the full works. But it's still, 70 billion is still a drop in the ocean compared to the rest of finance. So I think it's still at that phase where there's a tremendous amount of opportunity and an amazing window, I think, for fintechs, for banks to explore, to experiment, and hopefully adopt some of these things. Because fundamentally, all of this adds up to better outcomes for users and customers, right? So I think that window is very much there. I don't think it's necessarily kind of an existential crisis just yet. But if I think those entities don't take a look at this in the next 5, like over the next 5, certainly the next 10, that will be when kind of it shifts into far more of a existential crisis, I think.
And Niki, I'd love to chat with you a little bit more about the Chainlink business. It's been a phenomenal 12 months. And if we were to look at the token price on a market cap, you'd be a unicorn business by a country mile.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's the token itself has done relatively well. Yeah, there's significant demand there.
So there was a bit of stigma kind of in the ICO days about raising capital. What's the Chainlink Labs approach to raising capital, and how have you gone through this growth phase?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's amazing to see how, people evolve and processes evolve and so on. I think there's a lot of negativity, I think, that came out of the ICO boom out of 2017, 18. But a lot of those lessons, I think, have been learned. And I think there was a lot of money sloshing around and a lot of perhaps, too much money searching after for fundamentally found a lot of bad ideas. But I think what's happening now is an interesting combination, I think, of different types of actors with different sources of capital being able to fund a whole range of different projects. And I think, Chainlink's obviously one which has grown from that original ICO boom in the 2017. But what I love is seeing smaller projects that have very, very interesting ideas. And their cap table, in essence, is a combination typically now of high quality VCs that might be crypto native VCs, but we see non-crypto native VCs moving into the sector, typically some high net worth type individuals or private investors, and an allocation for kind of general investors, public investors. And typically it's some percentage allocation across those three. And I think that's typically the type of model that a lot of kind of higher quality projects are kind of being pursued. Just as an example, obviously we've got a lot of amazing local projects, that are highly successful in the DeFi sector. Synthetics is obviously, the most famous, but we have Mycelium. But just as another example, Amasa is a kind of a micro yield platform that's emerging soon. And they've essentially gone for that highly, democratized split between investors, because I think the important thing with capital investment for projects is it's not just about the actual dollar amount, but it's also what value those particular individuals or organizations can bring to growing the project as well. VCs have a part to play. Hopefully those users become important advocates, whether it's on crypto Twitter or wherever, and individuals as well. So I think it's an important amalgamation of those kind of three and even if that's being deployed in a crypto sense, there's still that value equation from those particular actors as well.
Now, the other thing that I really love about Chainlink Labs is they're not only innovators on the technology side, but they're also innovators on the human capital side. Niki, you were sharing with me earlier, the approach to hiring and having a truly kind of remote first approach. And that's been from day one. Could you tell our listeners a little bit more about Chainlink's approach to people and talent and culture?
Yeah, I think Chainlink Labs is probably one of those unique companies that they made some highly prescient decisions right from the beginning. And one of those was, and so the company started back in 2017, but they made the prescient decision to be remote first right from the beginning, so well before COVID. And so that actually frees the company up in a lot of different ways. So one of the classic examples is, for myself and many others who are hiring people into the company, it's very much a global perspective. So you're never restricted by a particular person for a particular role being in X time zone even, or particular country. So as an example, I just hired a crypto market research analyst. We obviously interviewed a whole bunch of people from around the world. It just so happens that he's based in Spain. Great, but he was the right person for the role. And so, it allows you to access a tremendous amount of human capital from around the world. And it just makes it a very different hiring process than if you were to say, well, that person has to just be in Sydney or Singapore or London or wherever.
Yeah, I'm hearing of many businesses, Niki, who are based here in Australia saying we're remote first. And yet when they're hiring, everybody has to be here in Oz. Yeah, it's crazy, eh? And then they complain about the skills shortage. And I'm talking about there being 7.6 billion people in the world, and they're saying you can't find developers anywhere. But I think it is such an interesting challenge for leaders, Niki, that we're seeing everywhere is, how do you get this remote first business? How do you get the output? How do you get the results? How do you get everybody focused on outcomes rather than just performing tasks? What's been your experience? You're in business development, right? That's a role that has, I think, always been a remote first role where, you mightn't be in the office, you're out there working from home or pounding the pavement.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, in certain roles, it definitely becomes easier. I think the post-COVID or the COVID version of pounding the pavement, at least in DeFi, is living on Telegram, basically. But
Yeah.
everything happens on Telegram.
Absolutely.
It's amazing, actually. You're talking about what's different at Chainlink. I get about 10 emails a day. That's it. Maybe 5.
Really? Wow.
Just everything
amazing,
happens on Telegram or Slack.
Tech company with no emails.
Yeah.
So how many countries are you in now, Niki, and how many people are in the business as well?
So in terms of number of countries, I think I'd probably roughly around 40, I would say. Again, it's one of those things where you very much find out about it after the fact because it's actually not that important. But the company's obviously growing, tremendously. We've pretty much doubled our headcount in the last 7 or 8 months. So we're about 260 people now. So growing very quickly. And for us, I mean, growth on one side of the equation, just in terms of us as a company, and then let me talk about, what we're actually targeting and where we'll be growing. But for us, I think just adding on to the point earlier about being remote first, as we grow and as we scale, and this is a key question we ask each other on the executive and management teams, is for us, it's partly about culture. And you would have heard this obviously in your career, Dexter, and many of us would have, but it does come down to trust. It's very much around outcomes. So, obviously because we're all operating at various times and whatnot, like you're not going to be monitoring whether someone's going to be working 9 to 5. And to be frank, it's not even important. So it's very much outcomes driven. One of the other key principles that is focus. So, and again, this is one of those things we talked about a lot in the corporate world, but there's just so many things we could be doing. And one of the hardest things that, at least, I started my career as a management consultant, saying no strategically is very, very hard. And it's something we pride ourselves in doing at Chainlink Labs as well, is just selectively, delivering on what we say we're going to deliver to our users and then building up over time. So I think, you can't add all those kinds of elements up. And that's really why I think a little bit of the secret sauce of Chainlink Labs being able to be now this 260 person company operating remote first. We're going to have our kind of get together, so to speak, once COVID lifts and everyone's going to fly in. We're finally, most of us are going to meet each other for the very first time.
Awesome.
So, but yeah, it's a very different kind of structure. And I think it requires a lot of those key things from a cultural perspective that people talk about in the corporate world, but you actually need to implement for this to be successful.
I think there's a perception, Niki, that startups themselves are remote first. And from what I can see, I don't think many of them actually are. And certainly the kind of feedback that I get from both their employees and leadership is that to be remote first is, they're finding it extremely difficult to be able to get results, get outcomes, get everybody on the same page. How do you manage somebody when you've been used to being sat next to them? And now all of a sudden you get a 30-minute Zoom call in which you've got to check in with someone and help them perform and help them develop and coach them. I think there's still a long way for us to go before businesses can really fully embrace the benefits of remote first and access, as you say, a global talent pool.
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely not easy, but I think it has to happen across the company. It has to come from up top all the way down.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
I think also the other thing perhaps to bear in mind is, obviously most of the world is still grappling with COVID and the working from home situation or hybrid or remote first. Everyone's kind of trying different things and so on. But I think the thing to bear in mind is as we come out of COVID, that light at the end of the tunnel, looking into 2022 and 2023, where you have some level of normalcy, is the level of competition. And I think this is really important for the bankers, the fintechs and so on as well, the startups, is that the level of competition is just going to go through the roof because there are going to be so many companies that have cottoned on to this fact that, wow, we can access global human capital globally. And then suddenly somebody's not going to want to work for the local company anymore because I can work for a Silicon Valley startup and do it remotely. So I think that's something I think it's going to be interesting to see how that washes through.
Yeah, there are so many impacts I think we're yet to see, Niki, from that. But absolutely, I think we now have to accept that whilst we can access global talent, global companies can also access our talent.
Exactly.
Which is a nice little segue, Niki, into what I wanted to talk to you about next. You and I last caught up face to face at Blockchain Week. Fantastic event. Felt like a real kind of landmark moment for the industry here down under. But yeah, like, just wanted to really get your sense as to what you felt as to how the industry was progressing here in Australia, and how we're comparing to the rest of the world.
I think, sorry, just to clarify, you mean from a crypto sense or fintech generally?
Well, Niki, I actually believe that crypto for me or blockchain is really the mesh, right, which kind of brings the whole fintech industry together. You know, it's the thing that you talked earlier about. We were talking about process improvement, as that being innovation 1.0, CX being innovation 2.0. I kind of see blockchain as being that thing that brings everything together now, where we can develop new products.
Yeah, fair enough. It's very, very forward thinking, and also I like your pitch about being the mesh, because that's part of the pitch for Chainlink as well. So good to hear.
There you go. I didn't even check out the website.
There you go. So I think it's interesting. So from a blockchain perspective, I think we're in this interesting position where, just to kind of contrast two sides of it, and to your point about the that event back earlier this year, which seems like a long time ago, at the ASX, which Steve Allison and the team set up. If you think about the enterprise side, I think we're in this point where people are just knuckling down, right? Like just actually executing, doing the hard yards of actually getting some of these projects out there. And that's definitely the case with the ASX blockchain project. And that's why I think in the next, say, couple of years, you'll probably continue to hear not very much coming out of the enterprise blockchain sphere, because people are knuckling down and executing. I think what's also happening, though, is from a blockchain perspective, is from a public blockchain side, DeFi, NFTs, there's a whole bunch of different kind of themes and trends that are emerging, which absolutely add value, which, portions of it are just fine, might be a lot of frothy stuff, but there is absolutely fundamentally value at the core of both of those propositions and many others that will emerge. And those...
You're not talking about the price of cyberpunks here now, are you, Niki?
Right. NFTs have so many amazing things, and so many, so many wrong things as well. So,
it's always the wrong things that end up in the media, right, though, isn't it? Eh?
Well, actually, just to digress for a minute, Dexter, I remember you and I discussing your mother asking you about the price of Dogecoin when we met. Met at the ASX.
Yes,
and look what happened to Dogecoin. It went big for a while. But I think what's interesting is, and to your point about blockchain and fintech, I completely agree. I think what's emerging now out of whether it's DeFi, whether it's NFTs and so on, are many of these interesting propositions that will come out of that classic blockchain sphere and will intersect with a whole bunch of other technologies and importantly create a new proposition. So part of it is, like you mentioned earlier, Square starting as this kind of business transaction engine, then moving into business banking, and then having an element that will invest in Bitcoin and giving businesses access to that, I'm sure, at a later stage, and other cryptocurrencies. And another way to think about it as well from the blockchain side is you've got all of these other technologies like IoT, for example, that are emerging, and those will start to intersect as well. So I think fundamentally what's going to happen and what should happen, and again, zooming out a little bit, what blockchain is there to do is exactly like you said, being the mesh, being the bedrock of many of these propositions, sourcing data, executing transactions securely across a whole bunch of different providers that don't necessarily trust each other. And then you enable a whole bunch of propositions on top of that. It's very much a layer. If you think about cloud computing as a layer, blockchain is essentially another layer that is emerging to decentralized computing. And I think that will just continue to emerge and actually accelerate. I think, like I mentioned earlier, many of us in the sector always forget that we're very early. There aren't that many companies doing on the enterprise side. DeFi is still 70 billion, again, a drop in the ocean. And so in the next 10 years, that will just accelerate and accelerate and intersect with a whole bunch of these other technologies that are emerging. And fintech and banking and so on will change as a result.
What an awesome time to be alive, Niki. So what can we expect from Chainlink in this next 12 months?
Yeah, so I think Chainlink, we just had our annual conference, SmartCon, late last week. So the videos, I think, will be uploaded soon. We had 15,000 people attend from across the world over 3 days. So that was amazing to see. But, there's a few things. So we started our journey as a provider of price feeds. So a very simple concept, like you mentioned earlier, Dexter, but knowing the price of Bitcoin, the exact price of Bitcoin that hasn't been manipulated, that hasn't been subject to a flash crash, or been hacked in some way, shape, or form is really important. So again, the simple concept of what we provide is price feeds to a whole bunch of DeFi projects. We secure about 70% of the global DeFi sector. So 70% is built on Chainlink price feeds. And just as a simple example, if you want to know what is the price of Bitcoin, the Chainlink, a whole bunch of data providers on the Chainlink network, anywhere between 11 and 21 are sourcing the price of Bitcoin from a whole bunch of different sources and exchanges and so on, aggregating that price. Then about 31 node operators are taking those prices in a decentralized form, and then finding the median price between all of those particular entities. So you have about 31 prices being aggregated. And the reason it's the median price is then if a top one or a bottom one are manipulated, or if 10 are manipulated, you still have the baseline median price. And so, and then that we have, so that's the price of Bitcoin that can be accessed by any DeFi user. And then that's being, across a whole bunch of different blockchains, a whole bunch of different price pairs, Ethereum, et cetera, et cetera. Those prices are being pulled and utilized in the DeFi sector. Then the second part, the extension of that, where it gets really interesting and where it gets out of classic DeFi land, is we also enable the ability to bring, as I mentioned, any form of off-chain data on-chain. And so if you think about an area that we're super excited by is parametric insurance. So if you're a farmer in Kenya, you typically don't have insurance coverage, small-scale farmer. You typically don't have insurance coverage. And so companies like Arbol, we just announced our partnership with Marsh and McLennan, which is the largest broker in the world as well. So all of these types of companies are looking at parametric insurance, and using the example of the farmer in Kenya, in that particular insurance contract, what you typically want to know is, was the level of rainfall, say, above 100 mils in 24 hours, as an example. And so what Chainlink is doing via our data providers and our node operators is we're pulling data from a whole range of different sources, from NASA, from NOAA, a whole bunch of different sources, to provide a distributed view on, was that level of rainfall above 100 mils or not? So you're not just depending on one particular data source. And if it is above 100 mils, then that contract is triggered and then the farmer is paid. So that's a very simple example, but you can think about the types of scenarios that can extend out to. It's any form of data that can be brought on chain to activate a smart contract. And then the final part, we're combining two additional concepts. So this is getting right into the exciting parts about pushing the envelope. But if you can imagine any form of data being pulled on chain, then two things can happen. We can actually analyze and undertake computation of that particular data as well. So if you think about, and this is where it gets really interesting, if you think about a solar field where a whole bunch of solar panels are operating, and you have an insurance contract that activates based on, say, five of those panels breaking down, then what we can do via IoT devices that are pulling that particular information, transmitting it via Chainlink, is we can then extend out to not just pulling the data, but analyzing the data to figure out across that particular solar panel field, has it dropped below a particular percentage in terms of operating efficiency? So it'll calculate that all off chain. And if it hits that particular percentage, then it'll send a message out on chain to activate that smart contract. So you're actually doing computation off chain as well. And then the final piece of the puzzle where it gets even more interesting is we've been busily integrating with a whole bunch of different blockchains. So as you can imagine, there are hundreds of different blockchains out there in the world. And in fact, we've announced our integrations with at least 10 of them. So you can send assets, send messages via Chainlink across not just Ethereum, but Binance Smart Chain, Polygon, XDAI, Avalanche, and a whole bunch of others, which will be announced shortly. But what we've announced is our cross-chain interoperability protocol that will allow any form of messaging and asset deployment across any chain via Chainlink. So essentially solving the interoperability problem. And that'll be rolling out in the coming months as well. So essentially a DeFi project or even just any form of enterprise blockchain project doesn't have to worry about which chain am I going to integrate on or deploy on. You can build it as you like and then deploy via Chainlink to any chain or multiple chains.
I'm just chuckling here, Niki, because I'm thinking in 10 years' time, you and I are going to be on this podcast talking about blockchain 2.0. Seriously, mate, I guarantee you we're going to be talking about CX.
It's all going to come back. It's all going to come back.
Better customer journey and better customer experiences. It is all coming back. It's all swings and roundabouts. Well, Niki, it's been fantastic to have you on the show. Great to hear how things are going at Chainlink for you as well. Where can people find out more?
Yeah, absolutely. Please check out chainlinklabs.com for additional information. We'll have a whole bunch of videos coming of SmartCon uploaded soon. And also feel free to reach out directly. It's Niki at chainlinklabs.com. Look forward to speaking with you all and growing the fintech community here in Australia.
Well, thanks, Niki.
Thanks, Dexter. Really appreciate it.
And you can connect with me, Dexter Cousins, on LinkedIn and Twitter. For early access to new shows and updates on the latest exclusive opportunities through Tier 1 people, subscribe to our newsletter by visiting the Fintech Chatter page on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, remember to press follow on your favorite podcast player and please consider leaving us a review. It really does help me in bringing in great guests and help fintech fans like you discover the show. Fintech Chatter is presented by Tier 1 people, leaders in fintech executive search. We'll help you launch, scale, and innovate by delivering world-class talent. And you can find out more at tier1people.com. Until the next episode, stay safe